While understanding what AI is great, how do you actually go about generating the right way? This is where prompting comes in. In this section, we'll look beneath the hood of what makes a prompt work and learn about language models. Then we'll expand that understanding further into LLMs, or large language models, and it's only once you understand how all of this works will it be easier for you to grasp your head around prompting and the principles of prompt design itself. Then we'll close things off by going through a list of key prompt types that can be used to prompt anywhere for anything. But before I have to say the word prompt another time, let's jump straight into it. So a language model is a statistical and computational system that enables computers to process, understand, and generate human language by learning from the patterns of large amounts of text data. You can broadly see there being two types of language models: statistical language models and neural language models. When it comes to statistical language models, they predict the next word or sequence of words based on the probabilities from patterns found in large amounts of text data. These models help to generate text by calculating the likelihood of different word combinations. And when it comes to these models, there are two key foundational models that you should be aware of, which are n-gram models and Markov models. N-gram models predict the next word in a sentence by looking at a fixed number of previous words to guess what comes next, and Markov models predict the next step in a sequence based on the assumption that the future depends only on a limited number of states. The second type of language model that we talked about is the neural language models. These models use artificial neural networks to learn more deeper, complex patterns and relationships in the data than statistical models. They capture more complex relationships in data, making them highly effective for many natural language processing tasks. There are plenty of types of different neural language models. For example, you have the feed-forward neural networks, or FNNs, which are the earliest types of neural models that take a fixed size, for example, a few words, and then it predicts the next word. You then also have the recurrent neural networks, or RNNs, which are designed to recognize patterns in sequences of data, allowing information to be retained across different points in time. And then you have long short-term memory type of models, or LSTMs. And you can see these as more of like a specialized form of RNNs that are capable of learning long-range dependencies in sequential data. Now, if you expand the amount of data sets that you feed a language model, you then get large language models, or LLMs. These are an advanced type of neural language models trained on extensive data from the internet and other data sets like books and documents. And these models have billions to even trillions of parameters, enabling them to capture a vast array of knowledge and linguistic nuance. Within large language models, you have these things called transformers, or transformer models, which are really good at processing language because of something called the self-attention mechanism. This allows the model to look at all the words in a sentence at the same time and figure out which words are most important to each other. For example, in the sentence, the cat sat on the mat because it was tired. The self-attention mechanism helps the model understand that it refers to the cat and not the mat. Now, transformer models look at all words in a sentence simultaneously, allowing them to understand context much better than earlier models. And this makes them perfect for tasks like translation and text generation and overall language understanding. In fact, the transformer model is so powerful that they form the foundation of many generative AI models you see today. Now, while OpenAI's GPT is the most widely known LLM as of now, there are actually quite a lot of different LLMs currently out there. You have BERT, T5, XLNet, Lambda, Lectrica, Palm, and Gemini, all created by Google. Then you have Megatron LM by NVIDIA, Llama by Facebook Meta, you have Ernie by Baidu, and Anthropic's LLM Claude. Now keep in mind, as much as LLMs have definitely brought about great change to the modern AI era, one key thing to remember is that LLMs are not perfect. For one, they have hallucinations. And this is when an LLM does not truly understand the content. It just simply recognizes the patterns, and so their responses actually lack any deep comprehension and sometimes can be factually incorrect. And then there's a problem of adaptability and applicability. Getting LLMs to adapt to a specialized niche area without fine-tuning it can be quite challenging, and this makes them limited in applicability in diverse settings. And of course, there's the problem of generalization. LLMs can overfit to the patterns seen during training, which means that this can lead to less reliable performance of tasks and result in generalization. You also have biases in the data. The performance of LLMs are heavily dependent on the size and quality of the trained data that you feed it. And collecting and curating data is well done by humans. And so as such, humans have biases. Biases can then seep into the AI model itself. And then resource intensiveness is also a big problem with LLMs. Training LLMs requires significant amount of computational resource, and it makes it difficult for small organizations to compete with large ones, which leads to this whole centralization of power in AI. And finally, you have the maintenance problem. Keeping LLMs up to date with new information and changing context requires ongoing effort, as their knowledge is essentially frozen at the point of their last training. So unless the company is training it very regularly, it's inevitable that the LLM output may be a little bit outdated in terms of its results. Now, over the years, there are 3 methods used to customize and tailor large language models to be used for specific use cases and tasks. These often include fine-tuning, prompt tuning, and prompt engineering. Fine-tuning is where you retrain a pre-trained language model on a specific smaller dataset to adapt it for a particular task or domain. This is particularly useful for very domain-specific applications of the AI, whether it be for medical or legal language processing. And then there's prompt tuning, which is when you optimize a small set of parameters, adjusting how a model responds to input prompts for a given task. And then finally, you have prompt engineering, where you craft and refine input prompts to guide a language model's output, using the model's existing capabilities without requiring additional training. With fine-tuning and prompt tuning, you usually have to do additional training separately. Now, up to 2020, fine-tuning was the primary method used. And while this is great for task specialization, as I noted earlier, the downsides of this is that it's very resource intensive, can be quite slow, and it requires continuous maintenance. Prompt tuning, on the other hand, is a more lightweight method of adapting LLMs to a specific task, and is a lot more flexible and efficient than fine-tuning. However, it has a lot of dependency on the prompts that you feed it initially, and is not as effective for very domain-specific complex tasks. And so prompt engineering, which is the more modern method these days, is quite fast and flexible. It's quite easy to execute as it focuses on the prompt designed by the user without any additional training required. And for the most part, it is more of a general purpose application. So think of it as having the power to speak to AI effectively. Now, speaking on prompt engineering, this works off of this idea of in-context learning, which is the ability for LLMs to learn and adapt to tasks based on examples, aka the context provided. So in-context learning is central to modern prompt engineering. It allows a model to perform specific tasks by simply being given examples or instructions directly in the prompt from the user, without any additional parameter updates. And unlike traditional AI models that require extensive training on labeled data, in-context learning leverages the model's pre-existing knowledge that you've already fed it. Then with prompt engineering, you also have this ability to do multimodal prompting. And this is the use of prompts that interact with multiple types of modalities, aka mediums, like text, images, video, code, etc. So this allows the AI models to work across different mediums, as I noted earlier, and this greatly enhances the versatility and potential of the AI system. But no matter the modality, in the end, clarity, specificity, and context are always key to achieving high-quality outputs. So then, with all this talk about prompting, what actually is the best way to go about writing prompts effectively? Well, for one, you should become familiar with the general anatomy of a prompt. The prompt should have context. This is when you give the AI some background information, providing greater context on the task. Then you feed it some instruction, which is telling the AI what you want it to do, defining the task to be done, and then you can feed it some role, getting the AI to assume a specific persona that can help clarify the response. You can then also adjust on the formatting, which provides the AI some sort of framework or structure in which it should respond. And if you want to add to this formatting, you have constraints, which is defining the parameter within which the AI should operate. It's essentially tailoring the output a little bit further. And lastly, you have the example, which lets the AI know a sample of an output that you expect to receive. Now keep in mind, none of these things need to be in this specific order, and you can just rearrange them depending on how you want. But for the most part, I tend to usually keep to this order and maybe switch around the context and the instruction. Now, beyond just knowing the general structure of a prompt, it's also worth noting some key principles when it comes to designing a prompt to help enhance the model's performance. For one, you should try to know your model. Test various prompt styles and observe the quality of the response. Spend time interacting with the model that you're working with, whether it be GPT, Gemini, or whatever. Then clarify and specify. The prompt should be clear and specific, leaving little room for assumptions or misinterpretation. Keep in mind, this AI does not know everything about you, so try to be as clear and specific as possible. And then give relevant context as well. Help the model generate more accurate, appropriate responses by giving it some background information about what you're trying to achieve. And then don't overload. Now, while it's important to provide enough information to the prompt, prompts should be concise. Don't try to overload a prompt with unnecessary information or fluff. Just get straight to the point. And of course, learn to refine. Prompt designing is an iterative process. What this means is that initial prompts will need to be refined based on the response and output you get. Try tweaking the wording, adding or removing context, adjusting the specificity that you provided. Sometimes it takes more than one time to get the response that you want. And finally, use examples. Include examples or templates in the prompt to guide the model more effectively, especially the more complex or creative the desired output is. If you don't have an example, you can always ask the AI for an example and then copy-paste that and refine your prompt. So now that you know the general anatomy of a prompt, some basic principles of prompt design, let's try to understand the different types of prompts that you should be wary of. First, you have the zero-shot prompt. This is the most basic type of prompt, and it enables the model to perform tasks without any prior examples. It really just relies primarily on the pre-trained data that you fed it. So think of shot in this case, meaning example, so zero example prompt. Now, an example of a zero-shot prompt could look like something like, summarize the key benefits of regular exercise. And then you have the one-shot prompt, which is providing a single example to guide the model. And this is super useful for demonstrating a task or just providing more context for the AI to understand what kind of output it should give. An example of this could be, or using the earlier example, summarize the key benefits of regular exercise. An example, regular exercise can improve cardiovascular health, enhance mood, and boost energy levels. Then you also have prompts like the few-shot prompt, which is just adding 2 or 3 examples, or the multi-shot prompt, which is adding about 4 to 5 examples. But just skipping that, we can go to the n-shot prompt, which is essentially providing a specific number of examples, in this case the letter n, precisely tailor the model's response to a task. So in the examples noted earlier, you can write, summarize the key benefits of regular exercise with n examples, and then indicate n equals 5. So then the output will give you 5 specific examples. Then you have the chain of thought prompt, which breaks down problem solving into sequential steps similarly to that of a chain. So it's useful for complex analytical or mathematical tasks. An example prompt here could be something like, solve the following math problem step by step. A farmer has 45 apples and decides to distribute them equally among his 9 friends. How many apples does each friend get? Then you have something called the tree of thought prompt, which guides problem solving or decision making by encouraging the AI to explore multiple possible branches of thought. So an example here could be explore and analyze the potential impacts of introducing autonomous vehicles into urban areas across different aspects. safety improvements, economic impacts, environmental effects, social changes. And then you have something called prompt chaining, which is different from chain of thought. So this is where you list a series of related prompts to guide the model through complex reasoning or multi-step tasks. And so you can write an example like, I want to understand more about plants. Break down the responses in the following steps. And then you provide some steps. List common types of indoor plants. Which of these plants thrive in low light conditions? Among these, which require minimal care? So you notice that these different questions are individual prompts in themselves, and I've just listed them out like a list. So I'm sort of like a chain connecting all of these individual prompts together in a single prompt. And then you have something called the generated knowledge prompt, which essentially encourages the model to draw on information or knowledge that it has been pre-trained on. And this is super useful for creating novel content. So for an example here, it could be something like, based on the current trends and advancements in technology, predict how society will function with augmented reality being integrated everywhere. And so here, I didn't give it any additional context. I'm just really drawing off of its existing pre-trained data. And then you have something called the least to most prompt, which gradually urges the AI model to increase detail or complexity of its output. And it's useful for teaching concepts at varying different levels of depth. So an example here could be something like, explain the concept of blockchain in a progression from the most basic explanation suitable for a young child to a more comprehensive explanation aimed at a university student. And then you have something called the self-consistency prompt, which aims for consistency in its response across different forms of the question. And this is super useful for verifying information reliability. So an example here could be something like, explain the process of photosynthesis, then explain it as if teaching a 10-year-old, and finally summarize the concept in one sentence. So by asking it to do these multiple things many times, you're actually sort of testing it, see whether or not it's actually giving you the correct response. Then you have the complexity-based prompt, which adjusts the response complexity based on the task's perceived difficulty or depth. So you can write something like, explain the concept of quantum entanglement, and adjust your explanation for A, and then you fill in the complexity level, where 1 is for a young child and 10 is for a college biology major. So in this case, you can fill in the complexity level here that's bracketed with the number 1 or the number 10. And then you have the maieutic prompt, which uses questioning to stimulate critical thinking and self-reflection within the model. And this mimics the Socratic method itself. So an example prompt here could be something like, why do you think your current approach to solving this problem might not be working, and what could be a different way to view it? And then you have something called the directional stimulus prompt, which guides the model to think in a very specific direction. And this is super useful for ideation or creative problem solve. So an example prompt here could be something like, imagine a city in 2050 that is fully sustainable. What innovative technologies and systems have been implemented to achieve sustainability? So think about this as you're sort of directing the model to think in a specific way. Then there is the positive negative prompt. And this is essentially just weighing out the pros and cons of a given issue. And it's useful for balanced analysis or decision making. So an example prompt here could be something like, discuss the positive and negative impacts of social media on teenagers. And then it will really just focus on the positives and negatives, nothing else. And then you have the interactive context-aware prompt, which is a bit of a mouthful, but is essentially a type of prompt that adapts the responses based on the interaction that you've had with it already, or some context that you give it. So it feels like a more personalized way to approach the LLM. So an example here could be something like, I'm planning a trip to Italy. What are some must-visit places? Also, I love art. Any recommendations? So I've given it some initial context to better understand what kind of output it should give. And then you have the MCQ prompt, or the multiple choice question prompt. And this is essentially providing multiple different options to the model to choose from. And this can be super useful for when you're testing yourself or you want to narrow down with the options that you have. So an example here could be something like, what is the best marketing strategy for the summertime for a beverage product? A. Influencer marketing campaign, B. Live event campaign, C. User-generated content campaign, or D. An online AMA. Explain your reasoning. Beyond prompt types, there are also specific structures or general templates you can familiarize yourself with when crafting a prompt. These prompt patterns help in shaping the AI's responses, making them a bit more accurate and relevant. And we'll start off with some basic prompt patterns. And keep in mind, I have bolded these examples for key trigger words you should pay attention to when writing out these prompt patterns. So we begin with the completion pattern. And this prompts ChatGPT to complete a sentence or idea that was started, and is a super useful pattern to use when you want to complete the sentence or text and continue from a starting point. It's often used to expand an idea or get some creative input. So an example prompt here could be complete the following sentence. In a world where technology can translate thoughts into speech, one young inventor discovers that ... And so you see the result here. You can see it complete the following sentence, and then that trigger word, and then I write whatever there is, and then I always need to end it off with a ... Next is the comparison pattern. And the comparison pattern prompts ChatGPT or any LLM to compare and contrast two or more items, concepts, or ideas. And it's super useful for understanding the differences and similarities between two or more subjects. So an example prompt here could be compare and contrast solar power and wind power as renewable energy sources. So as you see the result here, trigger word is compare and contrast, and the results were given here, given all the comparisons of different points of each solar power and wind power. And next on the list is the instructional pattern. And this is just the type of pattern that prompts the LLM to provide a step-by-step instruction on how to do something. So an example prompt here could be write out clear instructions on how to build a computer. And so you see the example here, the trigger words, write out clear instructions, and then it gives you this whole list of things you'll need, as well as a step-by-step way on how to go about building. Then next on the list is the Q&A pattern. And this is essentially when you prompt the LLM to answer whatever question you ask it. So the objective here is to get direct answers or explanations to specific questions. So an example prompt here could be answer the following question. What is artificial intelligence? So the result here, you see a trigger word, answer the following questions, and then I put in just another question, and the answer you can see. Then next is the opinion and argument pattern. And so this prompts the LLM to express an opinion or argue for or against a particular viewpoint. So the whole objective here is to generate text that reflects a specific perspective, opinion, or stance on a topic. So an example prompt here could be, what are the arguments for or against the use of nuclear energy? You see the result here. The trigger words are arguments for and against. And so that's going to start giving you all of the arguments for, and then it's going to give you all the arguments against it as well. Then you have the scenario pattern. So this is essentially triggering the LLM to explore a hypothetical scenario provided and respond to that. And the whole point of this is to explore possible outcomes, make predictions, and it's super useful for when you're doing scenario planning for a given campaign or wanting to just sort of speculate in the future. So an example prompt here could be, imagine a scenario where a city is full of flying cars. What are the potential benefits and challenges? So you see the result here, trigger word being imagine a scenario at the very beginning, and then it gives all of the different potential benefits as well as challenges of this hypothetical scenario. Then is the command pattern. And this is just a simple pattern to help command the LLM to take some sort of action. And so an example prompt here could be, execute the following command, write a poem about the experience of floating in the ocean. And so you see the result here, and execute the following command is what I put at the very beginning. So to give the LLM some idea, this is what I need you to do. And it does whatever you input it. And so once you have those basic prompt patterns in mind, you can take this a little bit further by now moving forward with some enhanced prompt patterns. And so these enhanced prompt patterns were introduced by Vanderbilt University's Jules White. So what this is a paper that specifically lays out different prompt patterns that will get ChatGPT to do a little bit more. We start off with the meta language creation pattern. And so this is just a fancy way to say creating references that you'll be able to look back on later. So this is really important especially when you're having a long conversation with ChatGPT. And so it comes super useful. I use it quite frequently, where you give a specific response a short code, and then later on in the conversation, instead of having to scroll all the way back up to that conversation, you just have to reference your short code. So an example prompt here could be, remember the shorthand for the rest of the conversation: APL equals apple, DNA equals banana, GRP equals grapes. And so you see the result here, and it's now going to remember these shortcodes that APL stands for apple, DNA stands for banana, and GRP stands for grapes. And then now moving forward, I can write something like, write a story about a woman walking to the grocery store and buying fruits, and it's going to use these references, these shortcodes in the future. And now this is a very simple version of the meta language creation pattern being used, but you can also use the meta language creation pattern in just all of your conversations. So what I tend to do is anytime I get a very long result of whether it's a campaign plan or some sort of draft for an article or some research, I give it a short code so that later on, if I need to reference that output, I can always just say, keep in mind, and then I just give the short code. And that way it'll allow ChatGPT to know, okay, I should be referencing this specific output that I gave it earlier. And then next is the persona pattern. And so the persona pattern is pretty self-explanatory. This one is just giving a specific role to ChatGPT so that it knows to take that role moving forward and can give a more customized, more personalized output based around that role. And so an example prompt here could be, assume the persona of a programmer and tell me all the methods I can develop an app faster. And so you see the result here, assume the persona is the trigger word, and you see that now it's going to act like a programmer and give some suggestions on how to go about developing this app. Then next is a prompt pattern called the recipe pattern, which prompts ChatGPT to provide a step-by-step guide, but almost in the form of a recipe. So this is great for customizing your outputs, and it's one step further than just a typical instructional pattern, because instead of just giving clear step-by-step instructions, now you're framing it like a recipe. So it might give you additional things you might need in order to achieve this in step-by-step guide. An example prompt here could be, give me a recipe for developing a simple mobile app that tracks daily water intake. And so you see the result here. And now you see it does give me the step-by-step instructions like a typical instructional pattern might give. But on top of that, it gave me some ingredients. And in this case, the ingredients would be the tools and technologies that are required to make this happen. And so this makes the whole flow a little bit more digestible, almost like a recipe for a meal. And then next is the template pattern. And so the template pattern is essentially getting ChatGPT to construct some sort of template that you may need in the future. And so an example prompt here could be, create an email template for requesting feedback on a project with placeholders for the project name and specific questions. And then in this case, you can also provide the template yourself and make any prompts following that. So you see the result here, and then this is the template that I was receiving, and then there's some placeholders where I could just fill out. And so all I could do here is just copy and paste the template, and then just fill out all the variables that I need that are more relevant to me. Then next is the fact check list pattern. And this prompts ChatGPT to verify a list of claims or statements that you may have received from an output, or perhaps you just have created on your own. And so an example prompt here could be, fact check all of the following points provided about the moon landing. And you give it, the moon is larger than the earth, the moon has quakes too, and there is water on the moon. You see the result here. I get a result. I gave it a list of things to fact check, and now it's going to go through them one by one. So my recommendation when using the fact check list pattern is to really give a list of things for it to check so that it can go through each one by one instead of just trying to overload it with too much information as a paragraph. Then next is the reflection pattern, and this prompts ChatGPT to reflect on specific arguments or opinions made for a deeper understanding of that topic, right? So this is really great for identifying errors and is useful if you want to encourage better accuracy of your responses. So an example prompt here could be reflect on the response provided and give detailed reasoning behind the response. And so you see here the result or the trigger word being reflect on the response. And this is based off of the response I got earlier. And now it's going to give me a breakdown of its reasoning behind why the moon is larger than, why it told me that the moon is larger than the earth is false, right? And it's going to give me a deeper reasoning behind that. So if you remember the earlier example I showed here, it just told me false, and then it just gave an explanation to it, but now it's going to expand upon that because it's reflected on its reasoning behind its response. And then next is the question refinement pattern. And this is where you prompt ChatGPT to essentially refine or rephrase a question that you give it. And this can really be useful for when you're trying to learn a specific subject because, as the saying goes, your answers are only as good as the questions you ask it. So knowing how to ask the right question is a very important skill. And so instead of trying to brainstorm how to ask the right question, you can just ask ChatGPT to refine the question for you. So an example prompt here could be, how can I refine the question? What is crypto to make it more understandable for the average person not in the industry? So what it's going to do is, as you see the result here, is going to give you a couple of more alternative questions, like to be able to paste this into the LLM itself. So you can see there's some options, and what I can do is just copy this and then paste that question into the LLM, whether it's ChatGPT or any other platform, and then you might get a clear response. Then next is the alternative approaches pattern. And this prompts ChatGPT to suggest different methods or perspectives for explaining or solving a problem. And an example prompt here could be, tell me alternative approaches to reduce stress besides meditation and exercise. And so you see the result here. I had the trigger word being alternative approaches. And so now it's just giving me some different approaches that don't involve meditation and exercise, like journaling, time management, creative outlets, and such. So they've just given me quite a lot actually here. And then the next prompt pattern is cognitive verifier pattern. And so this just prompts ChatGPT to check the logical consistency of the response to ensure that it's truthfulness, but also coherency. So this might be super useful if you want to verify a given statement. So that's why it's called the cognitive verifier pattern. And so an example prompt here could be, verify the logic behind the statement. All swans are white based on current biological classifications. And so you see the output here, statement all swans are white is false based on the current thing, and it gives contradictory evidence. And it's just really trying to ensure that you get the right response, as well as making sure that whatever output you get from the AI, you can double check it. So this is quite similar to the fact check list pattern, but it's just the fact check list pattern is more specific to a list that you provided, while the cognitive verify pattern is just more so trying to verify the logic behind things. Then you have the flipped interaction pattern. And the flipped interaction pattern essentially prompts ChatGPT to switch the role so the AI will then give you questions. And this will help when you're learning a subject to really test your knowledge, but also it's super useful for when you want to see gaps in your planning. Because sometimes when we're so involved in our planning ourselves, we don't realize that we may have missed a few things. So an example prompt here could be, after I provide an overview of my project, ask me questions to help refine my project goals. And so you see here, the trigger word here is ask me questions. And then I've also pasted a couple of some text to give the AI some context. And now based off of the context that it knows, it's going to ask me a couple of questions. So when you're doing this, I do recommend, if you do have like a project plan already in place, upload the project plan as a PDF file, and then you can ask this prompt. Remember, you need to give the AI some context about whatever your project is. Otherwise, it's not going to be able to ask the right questions to you. And so now looking at these questions, I can then think to myself, okay, did I cover everything here? Am I really well prepared? And then next is the gameplay pattern. And this is essentially prompting ChatGPT to design outputs in the form of a game with different rules and objectives. And this is really a great way to interact with the AI, especially if you're an educator or if you're a learner. And this can gamify the whole experience. An example prompt here could be, create a trivia game about space exploration, including questions, correct answers, and a brief explanation for each answer to help me learn. And so you see the result here. Now the trigger word is create a trivia game. And now it's going to start asking me different questions about the topic of space exploration. And if I were an educator, I could use it as material. If I'm just a learner, it's just going to test my knowledge.